Hey everyone, I'm really excited to be with Susan Etlinger. She is an analyst, researcher, a trend watcher. I'm going to say forecaster of cool things to come. So Susan, welcome to What If, So What?
Thank you, Jim. It's great to be here.
So, Susan, give us a little bit of background, kind of what brought you into your role, what interests you, what drives you, how'd you get here today?
Yeah, so I am one of these people who actually started in technology through the humanities route, meaning that when I was younger and I was in college and I was studying, I was really convinced I was going to be a professor at some like leafy little university and think deep thoughts and read great books and do all that stuff. And I moved to San Francisco. Went to Berkeley and I moved to San Francisco. When I was at Berkeley, I studied rhetoric. And when I moved to San Francisco, of course, the big gig in town was technology. And by a series of happy accidents, I found myself working for a technology firm first time out. And I realized that a lot of the interest that I had had as a translator, as a kind of, uh, you know, I mean, I wasn't a literary critic, but like as somebody who really, read
Someone with
things.
an opinion.
Yeah, that I was just as interested in, if not more, in technology. And so I started out as a little baby technical writer and worked my way through and did a lot of comms work, marketing work, and I was an industry analyst for about a decade. And I'm just wrapping up a stint at Microsoft. So it's been a really kind of a winding road. I think you talk to a lot of people who have been down a winding road. I
Right.
was one of those people.
That's great. I love that background because you I find a lot of people in this industry with different backgrounds. You think computer science major, but what I also find is like music majors. I see
Yeah.
there's this, and I know there's been a lot written on the relationship between coding and composing music.
Yeah.
There's something there. There's something deep there, but I also think that there's a lot more depth and thought and psychology and humanism. Ironically, we'll get back to that. We'll get to that on the topic today. Like, how does that relate to technology? Because at the end of the day, we're all end users. So,
Yeah.
um,
I mean, honestly, like just to kind of take it quickly now, you talk to a lot of people who will say, I started, in my garage, taking apart Commodore computers and putting them back together. And it's a really familiar story. I started like in my bedroom, taking apart books and putting them back together. And what's interesting is that when you think about sort of where we are with language technologies and even vision technologies, a lot of it is about understanding the inner workings of language and the inner workings of how we see and perceive things in the world. And so that's kind of the orientation that I bring, and I think it's as valid. And at this moment, it's actually really, really
right.
important.
I totally agree, and we're gonna jump into that. We're gonna focus on AI today. It's kind of a new topic. Um, and just kidding. So, there are a lot of waves, though. We've seen you've been in this space for a while. You've seen it grow up and evolve. Like a lot of sort of waves and emerging technologies and waves of old ones. It seems to be moving very fast. And there's a lot of fear, uncertainty, doubt, threat, hope, excitement. So right now in this current wave of AI, do you think it's truly as disruptive as it appears to be, as
Oh
everyone's
yeah,
saying?
I do. I do think it's as disruptive. And it's funny, like if you go back, like in some ways, AI is like 70 plus years old. If you go
Right.
back to Alan Turing, right? And the Dartmouth Conference in 1956 and the coinage of the term artificial intelligence. Um, but we have been going through, we everyone on this planet have been going through these technology platform shifts, for years and years and years. You can even go back to the Gutenberg Bible, right? Or even further probably in terms of it's part of human history that new technologies come and they disrupt and they change the way we do things, and we learn from them and we move on and we figure out how to use them in new and innovative ways, and sometimes in ways that accrue to the good and ways that sometimes don't accrue to the good. But this platform shift in particular, in fact, we were talking about Kevin Kelly earlier. and the inevitable. And one of the things that he talks about in the inevitable is that in order for AI to succeed, you need three things. You need copious amounts of data. You need, reasonably priced computing power, and you need algorithms. And we're at this moment now where we have just insane amounts of data and all sorts of types of data. We can talk about that. Computing power is at a place where, obviously the capabilities that we have today far outpace, even what was possible 10 years ago. And as a result of those two things, algorithms have gotten so much better. And so now the pace of change is, that flywheel is moving faster and
Yeah.
faster.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. And it is fundamentally disruptive. We talk about a lot in our practices, an AI first mindset. And, sort of in that theme of deconstructing, my mind kind of goes there a lot. What does that mean to be AI first, or to have a mindset? And it's not just thinking about AI or learning about AI. It is really, how does that fundamentally change the way we design systems? Like, I think we think of systems as, well, I send a query and it, looks up a database and returns a result. And what we're talking about, with generative AI and with agentic AI this is not simple retrieval of information. And so I think that's the really powerful part. I find that challenging to explain, um, easy to demonstrate, like, well, this is where you used to work with it, and now, we're going to send this task or this thought or this question to an LLM, and here's how they're going to handle it differently. And so, yeah, sort of seeing that is that's, to me, is the most disruptive part. But it also seems like, I would say 5 years ago, we would talk about AI. And speaking for myself, we would kind of go back to machine learning. That was, AI, that's just machine learning, or that's visual, visual learning, or a vision system. 3 years ago, it became generative AI. So the generative AI became synonymous with AI. And it seems like this year, the last 7 or 8 months, agentic is the new AI, which of course is powered by, or made interesting by, generative AI. So there's a coupling there. But in this sort of agentic moment, if we can call it that, why do you think that is so compelling? Why do you think agentic is sort of taken over the moment?
Yeah, well, let's go back to AI first for a second, because there's an interesting nuance about AI first, which is that AI first, I've had this conversation actually with a lot of people about, what do you think AI first means? Do you think that you use AI before you use anything else? And actually, I think one of the most thoughtful responses I got was from someone who said, no, it's not that you use AI before you use anything else. It's that you consider AI for the task
Hmm.
before you consider other technologies. Meaning, is there an opportunity by using AI to do something in a way that you could not have done otherwise? And not only is there an opportunity, but is it the right, like, and because when we talk about AI, of course, we're talking about multiple models, multiple
Right.
technology, multiple definitions. It is a massive simultaneous equation of what AI could possibly mean. So going back to AI first, I think is important because it it stops you for a moment and makes you think, what is it actually that I'm trying to do? And can I Occam's razor this, or should I Occam's razor this and do sort of the simpler possible thing? Is that enough? Or is there enough upside on the other side, whether in terms of efficiency, innovation, or both, to
Mhm.
be able, to make AI, whatever it is that I'm using at that moment, to make that worth the squeeze? And I think that's a really important, and also it should we be using AI in that context, because of course AI has, environmental consequences.
Right.
And
Right.
so I think, what I'm arguing for here by talking about AI first before we talk about agentic is that, there we are on a very fast spinning hamster wheel. And I think there's a lot of FOMO out there, particularly by leaders who are thinking, I have to get into this, I have to do this. And they do, because they have to learn, right? You have to, this is a learn by doing kind of technology.
Yeah.
Um, so, but at the same time, I think it's really important to consider, what is it that I'm trying to do, and is this the right approach? And even if it's not quite the right approach, can I learn something in the process? So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
part one. And then part two, in terms of sort of the agentic thing, is that, generative AI has opened up the potential to do so many different things, to automate so many different kinds of processes. And agents, as we think about them, are simply a way of automating things beginning to end. And, just one simple example is when you order something in e-commerce, there's a lot of friction in that process. Probably less friction than some other things, but like, you order something, it gets shipped, it gets delivered to you. That is a fairly straightforward process. There are a lot of
Yeah.
other processes though where you want more humans in that loop. So with the agentic moment, I think the big question is, again, like, can we, but also should we? Like, is this something that we actually want to automate and delegate to technology, or should
Yeah.
we keep it, and why? And that, I think, is one of the most interesting questions today.
Well, I love the experimentation. I think there's, I've been kind of reading and hearing that we're getting past this sort of POC everything stage. I mean, I still have customers that are, interested in some sort of lab, where they can, because they're a little bit behind or they've been hesitant. But there are a lot of organizations that have feel like they've POC'd it to death. They think
Yeah.
we kind of get it, but they're still hesitant. And so, um, and I also I also hear stories about, treating AI as like something you buy, like it's a platform. Like, well, I have to decide which AI I'm going to use. And you mentioned, you kind of alluded to that, the understanding models and what models are the best fits. And, do I, do I train that, or not train, but tune that model? So, so much, again, changing the mindset. But, a lot of people they've gone through the POCs, they maybe fundamentally get it, but they haven't sort of found the killer use case or the killer
Yeah.
business case. I know a customer recently that spent quite a bit of money on. I'm not going to mention the organization, nor the technology. They couldn't quite, make the finances work in their mind, whatever
Right.
hurdle they have to get over. So I'm seeing that. But what other challenges are you seeing or hearing about? Because again, we both agree. I think we all agree it's real. The promise is there. It is fundamentally disruptive. Um, we kind of know what it's going to take, but there still seem to be barriers. And what other barriers are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think one is the business strategy, right? Is, what are you solving for? Do you have the right use case? And there are lots of different ways to consider use cases. This is not anything new to any kind of C-suite leader.
Yeah.
The next one is like your platform. Do you have the data that you need to tune, like the proprietary data to tune the models? Because out of the box, like, every single model is pretty much the same. And, sorry, model creators. I mean, they do
Yeah.
have different, but in terms of like your competitive advantage, company A versus company B, if you're both using, a specific model, you're both getting the same advantage unless you're fine tuning it with your proprietary data. Right. So that's really what I mean there. And then the whole question of, like, we all know data, AI runs on data. Data is the fuel that powers AI. Clean, accessible, all that stuff is critically important. And the computing power, of course, is important, and the security and all those things. So that's the sort of technology side of it. And then there's a side around sort of understanding organizationally, like, do you have an operating model for this? Are
Yeah.
you sort of just trying experiments, or do you actually have a way that you are building out to be able to scale something across an enterprise? Because a single departmental use case is quite different from scaling that entire use case across an enterprise. The governance is critical. Like, so there are
Right.
lots
And I
of
was just
different
going to chime
pieces.
in on that. Yeah. Governance.
Responsibility,
responsibility. Oh my
AI,
God, we
security,
just
privacy.
jinxed on responsibility. That was
Yep.
great.
All right. Well, I guess we end the podcast here then, probably,
So it's over now.
until you say my name.
Oh, that's great. Well, it's interesting you mentioned the model the foundational models are there's I don't want to say total parity, right? But I was making a joke about that with people. It's kind of like, what's your favorite, why, and it's like choosing between In-N-Out Burger and Five Guys. Okay, where do you go? Or my new favorite, the Habit. I'm new to the Habit Burger, so
Mm-hmm.
um, you know,
Never.
so anyway, yeah, I think I'm glad you mentioned data as well, because I think I'm running into more use cases where there's definitely an expectation that the AI just sort of knows things, and they're sort of bypassing that data problem. And I think that's becoming more and more evident that there is a while there is a abundance of data. We have more data. We're producing more data points than ever for lots of reasons. We don't necessarily have it in a usable place or in a usable manner. And we still don't have the data that we want, and so to really pull off what we want, we still have to get things out of their head, like, well, who knows about that machine over there? Who knows about that customer? Well, that's this person, and it's all in their head. I don't know how to get that out of this person's head,
Yeah.
but we've got to do that. But that kind of brings up, the human factor. So, and we hear a lot the term human in the loop. I think that's sort of become a mainstream term now. You hear grandmothers talking about the human in the loop. And so it's becoming known, but, you know, there are many other human factors. How do you see sort of this role of humanity, especially, in your background? And, how do you see the humanity, being, um, properly, I would say, integrated into an AI first business model?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where you get to the distinction between agents and agency, right? And agency is that power, it's that capability, it's that intention. And, um, you know, and it goes back to sort of like, okay, can we automate this process beginning to end? Do we have the data? All those things. Let's say, all things considered, yes, we have essentially what it needs to do that. And now there's the question of should we? And I'll just sort of illustrate with an example from early in my career. And this is something I actually think I'm thinking about a lot, and I don't fully know how to articulate it. So we're all along for the ride now, which is that early in my career, I worked for a CIO. I was her comms manager, and I ran her quarterly business review. And in order to do that, as a 700-person technology organization, in order to do that, I had to pull inputs from 80 different people in the organization. And very often there were things like the finances, things like, operations, the peak to average ratio in terms of like the ability of the systems to handle the workloads and all that kind of stuff. Outages, call center CSAs, all those things, or call center SLAs, all those
SLAs,
things.
yeah.
And so it was 80 different people I had to talk to. And very often, and it was a huge, massive spreadsheet. And it was, me at my desk at 11 p.m. crying a lot of nights because I was asking people for data that their managers and their skips and their skips and their skips
Yeah.
hadn't seen. So I was going to show it right to the CIO
Yeah.
because that was the process. So I went into my manager's office, and she was the SVP of that team. And I was pretty much in tears, which was a big no-no. And I said, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, I'm just like a humanities girl. I have no idea like what this is and what I'm doing and why I'm doing this and how it's going to help my career. And she says, like, first of all, pull yourself together, sit down. And she says to me, you are doing IT strategy work right now. You are responsible for pulling together the data that is going to inform our IT strategy for the years to come. That is your job. And I was like, that's my job? That's what I'm doing? I thought I was pestering people and pissing them off and annoying them and trying to figure out how to get the data out of them. She's like, that's called stakeholder management, Susan. Now,
Okay.
today, if we were to do this, or the way that organizations are doing this, you can automate a lot of that, and you should automate a lot of that. There's no reason that the next Susan should be crying at her desk at 11 p.m. But I learned so much. And so one of the things I think is so important, I learned stakeholder management, I learned finance, I learned operations, I learned how our systems worked. How will I learn that? How will the new people coming up learn that? And we see this with developers too. And so I think that goes back to can we take a moment and think expansively? That to me is one of the biggest questions that I have about how we use agents intelligently, so that we're not automating away the cognitive load that we need in order to be able to continue
Right.
to innovate.
Susan, I love that nuance, and I think we are starting to see that. I think I've heard some stories about sort of the equivalent of, when I over relied on a generative solution to do the thinking in the sort of ingestion and the processing and the I'm sort of the training the faculty, the brain faculty, the memory. It's equivalent of like cramming for an exam the night before. People who've done well. And I've actually done this with folks. So tell me more. You sent me an interesting memo. Now tell me what you meant by that. And they can't tell you, because they didn't really go through the rigor of writing it, or and putting the humanity into it. So that's an interesting dilemma that I think we have never had before, or I used to, when my kids started driving, they wanted to take the GPS to go down the street. And I said, no, you're going down the street, you're going to have to learn how to navigate on your own and develop, that capability. So it's something, do you see that as sort of just just sort of a momentary adaptation, or do you see this as sort of one of many sort of responsibility sort of impacts that AI is having, not just on
Mm.
business, but on society? Like, how do you,
Yeah, no, I mean, I see it as momentary, but only in the geological sense, right?
yeah, yeah,
In the geological sense, it's a blip, but I think, it's got to be really important for us. And if you don't if my impassioned, Susan crying at her desk story isn't enough, think of the value chain, right? Because right now, what are we doing with our large models? We're pulling from, you know, thousands of years of human history that have been encoded into whatever data is being used to train those models. And, there are reports out there that say historians are going to be automated away and, all sorts of other sort of things that, all sorts of other roles. And then the question is, okay, so then who's going to write today's history, right? Who's going to do the work to find the sources that are not already
right,
accounted for in the
right,
models? Who's going to provide the perspective on those sources? Who's going to do that work? And what will happen in the value chain 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now? So I'm trying to think about it. So I think that's something we will acclimate ourselves to in the same way we've acclimated ourselves to every platform shift that's happened.
hmm
But if we look back at all these different shifts, whether we're talking about mobile or the internet or cloud or PCs or, whatever, the telegraph, telephone, cars, there are things that we've learned about how we coulda, shoulda, woulda used them.
hmm
And so what I'm arguing
sure,
for, let's take that. Let's take that moment now.
yeah. Well, I think I don't know who said this, but it was, like you can't, you can't. A side effect of the automobile industry is car accidents. The side
Mhm.
effect of electricity in every home is, electrocution. Really dark, but yeah, it's in a way, it's not a fatalist kind of view, but it's the difference here is that, I think Gilda Radner said, like, reality is just a shared hunch. I think I might be, don't give me a direct quote on that, but it was kind of the idea like, hey, we all kind of agree this is it, then this is it. You
Yeah.
know, AI is interesting because, and I found that there's a lot of notion of model collapse out there, and when the model
Mm.
just starts feeding on itself, then
Right.
what
Right.
is that giving us? So,
Right.
wow, that is that is big. That is really heavy stuff, Susan. I mean, we got really existential here, but for our listeners, so we've talked about sort of how this is evolving, the different ways I think to think about humanity and going beyond the human in the loop. But just for the average listener, who's in this agentic moment, um, if they haven't dipped their toe in yet, or they're thinking about what to do next, what's sort of one piece of advice, one actionable piece of advice that you would give the listeners?
Yeah, yeah, and I'm gonna frustrate you by going back for a second and just reminding ourselves that like there are thousands of languages in the world, and our models really only represent a small fraction of those. And those languages represent people, real people in the world. And so that is one thing. There's a professor at Stanford, Tom Mulaney, and a number of different people who are working on trying to make sure that um, that we have access to the data and the information from multiple languages and that multiple people are represented. And I think that's really important too. And of course, that carries its own chain of responsibilities. But in terms of the one piece of advice, I mean, I think it's find something um, compelling and relatively low friction that you can automate and learn from. And the difference with this technology, one of the many differences, is that it's so accessible. And, people have said this to me many, many times, and I'll repeat it. It's you just have to start
Yep.
because it is a compounding competitive advantage. If you start today, you will compound from today forward. If you started 5 years ago or 3 years ago when generative AI came on the scene, you're seeing the compounded results of that, both positive and possibly also negative, but you've learned. And so I think that's the important piece.
I agree. I have a few places I like to send people, and you're right. The accessibility of it is what's fascinating. And I know when I was getting my daughter into this a few years ago in school, and the data sets that are out there, the training data sets, not the model training, but the educational data sets. It's pretty cool what's out there, and I agree with you that the tools, I mean, are democratized, I guess is the word that comes to mind. Another thing that makes this really fascinating. So, well, Susan,
Yeah.
thanks for your perspective and your humanity today for having us.
It's the least I can do.
All right, take care.
Thanks, Jim.
You've been listening to What If, So What, a digital strategy podcast from Proficient with Jim Hertzfeld. We want to thank our Proficient colleagues J.D. Norman and Rick Bauer for our music. Subscribe to the podcast and don't miss a single episode. You can find this season along with show notes at proficient.com. Thanks for listening.